Hi, everybody.
Welcome, everyone. Hi.
Who you're hearing off camera is Lisa Smart, and she's the Dean of the University of Heaven. She also wrote a wonderful book called Final Words, and we're going to talk about her research and how it contributes to the understanding of the science of spirituality later on.
Thanks, Mel. Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Well, let's get started. The science of the near-death experience. When I trained at Johns Hopkins, I'm a physician, and we didn't think that science could have anything to do with spirituality. This is a very exciting time that we're living in now. The long-awaited reunion of science and spirituality is at hand. And as we're going to discuss, by understanding the science of the near-death experience, we'll understand the science of spirituality in general. And we can use these lessons, have better relationships, better intuition, better decision-making, and a better relationship with whatever word you use for God, higher power, universal consciousness. The last I checked, there's dozens and dozens of words for this universal consciousness that we're all in connection with through our brain. And we learn that by studying the science of the near-death experience. I'll just introduce myself real quick. As I said, I'm a former critical care physician. Got interested in near-death experiences when I was working at Seattle Children's Hospital. And at that time, I had no knowledge or understanding of near-death experiences. When I thought, you're dead, you're dead. You know, it's just, you know, the consciousness is created by the brain. And so obviously, when the brain dies, then consciousness is over. And certainly that's the traditional scientific and medical point of view for the last many hundred years. And as I said, we're at a time of a changing paradigm, and I'm going to go over that in the next many minutes. So I happen to be working as a critical care physician in Pocatello, Idaho, and resuscitated a young girl who nearly drowned in a community swimming pool. And she was profoundly comatose. You know, she was clinically dead. So far gone that I had her parents pray at the bedside for her, so that you know, that they could. We were going to transport her to Primary Children's Hospital, so I wanted them to be able to say goodbye to her. To my great surprise, she completely recovered 3 days later. And I happened to see her in follow-up. And at the time, it was not known why she had fallen into the swimming pool and, you know, nearly drowned in the first place. So I just said to her, well, you know, what do you remember of what happened? And she said to me, do you mean when I was with the Heavenly Father? And, you know, and I did. I sort of laughed the way a teenager laughs, you know, when he's confronted with something he doesn't understand. And she looked at me and she leaned over and she patted my wrist. And she said, you'll see, Dr. Morse, heaven is fun. And as a result of her experience, she described her own resuscitation in tremendous detail. At a time that I knew she was clinically dead, she was able to recall conversations I had with the nurses, conversations I had with Seattle Children's Hospital, getting advice from them. She said, I saw you put me in a big tube that looked like a donut, which was her description of a CAT scanner. She said, I saw you put a tube in my nose. And then she had an experience of going to heaven, met someone she felt was Jesus, and she said he's very nice. And then she made a full recovery. Well, primarily, I would have just dismissed this as some sort of, I don't know, fantastic hallucination or something like that, except that she gave such detailed descriptions of her own resuscitation at a time that I knew that she was clinically dead. And also we taped their eyes closed as a part of resuscitation, so, they don't, accidentally injure their eyes or anything like that. So, I knew she wasn't seeing anything through the ordinary senses. And I returned to Seattle Children's Hospital, and we did our own study it was actually the first controlled study of near-death experiences. We studied near-death experiences in children over a 15-year period. Of course, it was run by the head of the intensive care unit, head of the Department of Neurology, head of the Department of Neuropsychology at the University of Washington, and it was vetted, of course, by the Human Subject Review Board, so that we did everything proper and ethically, which, of course, you want to do in interviewing children. And we published our results in the American Medical Association's pediatric journals and several other prestigious medical journals. And that started me on a process of trying to understand what, in fact, these experiences are. Now, I'm going to talk for, a little over an hour. And there's a lot of information I'm going to go over with you. So I'm going to leave time for, 45 minutes for questions. This is going to be new information, and it's also going to be conceptually difficult to understand at times information, because we're so conditioned to believe that the brain creates consciousness. And when we start to think about consciousness working through the brain, that it will involve, not just just learning, but you have to start to understand this information in your heart as well. So I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions. I do have slides, primarily because I want to show you pictures. However, I'm going to read the slides to you. So I don't want anyone to be distracted, worrying about reading the slides. I'll read them out loud. And then, of course, you can watch this over and over again, so you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything like that. All right, so let's get started. But was it real, Dr. Morse? Because if it was, you have to tell all the old people. This is a young man, Chris Eggleston. His car flipped over. His parents were driving home from a ski vacation, flipped over a guardrail, and fell about 40 feet into a lake and river that was underneath the highway. He was underwater for about 45 minutes. And one reason that I want to share this information with you is I feel like I'm one of the most blessed people. I feel very grateful that I'm able to interview these children myself and hear their stories for the first time. Because this young man, he says to me that he floated out of his physical body, and then he says, I was in a huge noodle. And then he says, oh, no, it couldn't have been a noodle, because I don't think noodles have rainbows in them. It must have been a tunnel. And the reason it's so wonderful that I was able to hear him tell it for the first time is because after that, and he starts to learn about near-death experiences, when I heard him talk about it later on, he just talked about the tunnel. But the first time he told me it was a big noodle. And that's he, of course, struggling to understand what the experience was. He said that he went to animal heaven, and then he went to human heaven. And then he asked me this question when I was interviewing him. But was it real, Dr. Morse? So what he means by real is, can we trust the information that comes from these experiences? Or are these just hallucinations of the brain and just, the brain struggling to deal with the processes of dying? So that's the question. And then his mother said something very interesting to me. She said to me, yes, because if his experience was real, then my experience was real. And here's her experience. Her experience was that after she was rescued, divers had to smash the windshield of her car and pull her to the surface. And her husband, who was driving, unfortunately, he passed. So they wanted to rescue everyone who was living first. And so while she was by the side of the river and they were covering her with blankets and such as that, she had the perception that her husband was right there next to her. And he said to her, everything is going to be all right. There's nothing to worry about. And he was so real. He seemed exactly as we're having this conversation, as real as perhaps the people in the room with you. And she was furious with him. And she said, how can you say that? They're down there trying to save our son. And you're just sitting here. Why aren't you helping them? How can you tell me everything's going to be all right? And then he disappeared. And so she had, an after-death visitation. Because of course, he, unfortunately, had passed from the injuries suffered from the accident. So, but her question, I think, is an important question, because if near-death experiences are real, then that means that the entire range of spiritual visions surrounding death and dying probably are real as well. They include premonitions of death, shared dying experiences, and then after-death communications, which she had. Now, there's a second aspect to wondering whether these experiences are real. And if these experiences are real, then we can learn something about the way the brain processes these experiences. We can learn something about how these experiences occur. And in learning the neuroscience of spirituality, we actually we open a manual for how our brain works in terms of using our brain to communicate with what children just call God. I know there's so many names that we adults use. And intuition, meditation, better relationships, and basically happier, more meaningful lives. We can learn all of that if we can trust the information from the near-death experience and trust that these experiences are in fact real. Alrighty, let's go on. Okay. So what is a near-death experience? Well, the near-death experience is in fact the dying experience. We encounter dead relatives or comfort persons or objects that help us with the transition. For children, frequently it could be a dog who was previously passed, could be a stuffed animal that was important. One young teenager said to me that a nurse had been sitting next to her while we resuscitated her. And she said it was so nice that nurse just held my hand and comforted me and told me everything was going to be okay. Well, I was in the room when we resuscitated her, and in fact, there was no actual physical, living nurse who did that. That was her comfort, her spirit guide to help her with the experience. There's often a sense of separation from the body, and then we interact with a godlike being that radiates unconditional love. One child said it best. She said to me, "It's a light that had a lot of good things in it." Adults particularly often have a life review of lessons of love that they were challenged with during this life. And it's a life review that has no judgment, only compassion. And then during the process of dying, we enter into another reality, one that is timeless, spaceless, contains all the knowledge that ever was and ever will be, and consists of unconditional love. And as one child described it to me, he said, "It was real, Dr. Morse. It was realer than real." And this interface between this reality and this ultimate reality, this realer than real reality, which is interestingly what the Tibetan Buddhists over 2,500 years ago used the exact same term for it, is often perceived as being a tunnel. And so on the left of my screen, you can see this is a young girl, the one who nearly died in the community swimming pool. And she said that a spirit guide named Elizabeth came to her, and then they went down a tunnel to a place she felt was heaven. And then this is one of my favorite on the right side of my screen. You can see there's up in the top right-hand corner is a castle. And then in the middle of the picture is, she said it was a meadow, and she said it had beautiful colors that were vibrant and bright. And often she said there were many colors that don't even exist in this reality. And then in the bottom of the picture, you can see she's drawn sort of a black half circle there. She's emerging out of the tunnel into the place that she describes as being heaven. Well, so how do we know that the near-death experiences are, in fact, the dying experience? Well, actually, we've known this for 75 years. The first study that I'm aware of in the medical literature on near-death experiences describes them as the dying experience. And that was done by D. Pasquale and Phillips, and published in the American Heart Journal in the mid-1800s. And they interviewed survivors of cardiac arrest, and they describe, they said, this is the best way we know of to learn what the last few minutes of life are. So we use the term near death, but it really should be called the dying experience. There's been numerous other studies, a study from the journal the Swiss Alpine Club of mountain climbers who fell from great heights and then were saved by falling into a snowbank. They describe what their final minutes were like. And these are, they were not comatose. So they're fully awake and aware, and yet they had this exact same experience of what the last few minutes of their life would have been if they weren't fortuitously saved. And then there's a gentleman named Peter Fenwick in England, and he did a very, very nice study of the dying, and he really shows this very well. This was done in 2005. He did a study, it's called The Art of Dying. And he describes, interviews dying patients and their caretakers, their loved ones. And they describe the exact same experiences that we see in near-death experiences. So the dying describe the exact same experiences. Specifically, they have visions. They often have comfort visions, like we were talking about, that children and adults have that help them with the transition. They perceive a new reality, and they see this light, and there's many paranormal type experiences. One of his patients said, "As my father died, something that is very hard to describe because it was so unexpected, and I had never seen anything like it. It left through his body and out his head. It resembled distinct, delicate wavelengths of smoke, Smoke is not the right word, but I don't have a good comparison. And then it disappeared. And this is very much the way of the near-death experience. I've interviewed really hundreds and hundreds of children and adults with this experience, and they all say that the words that they are using do not, in fact, describe the experience. And so here's a nice example of what I'm talking about. One of Peter Fenwick's subjects, this is a daughter, said, I was aware that my father was sitting at the foot of the bed. My mother was staring at him, and her face was lit up with joy. And I saw her face. It appeared to be glowing with a gold light, and the light began to leave through the top of her head and go towards the ceiling. Looking back to my mother's face, I saw that she was no longer breathing. So she, in fact, describes the last seconds of her mother's life. And on the right-hand side of my screen, this is one of my subjects from my study of near-death experiences. And we are now looking down at her figure. She's on a hospital gurney. She nearly died from presenting to the emergency room with a blood glucose of over 1,700. She describes everything accurate. She said that the physician attending her was a female wearing a green mask, and that those details were in fact accurate. They thought she might have an infectious disease. And she describes the exact same experience of that sense of being a light and the light then leaving the physical body, precisely as dying patients describe it. Well, so just to make a long story short, near-death experiences are in fact real. And the science of near-death experiences clearly documents this. Well, what scientific evidence am I talking about? Really, that's why I'm leaving lots of room for questions, because I'm going to go over this evidence. There's 7 categories, and I'm going to go over it fairly quickly. I'll briefly outline it, and then I'm going to leave lots of room for questions. But basically, the evidence is collections of stories. Number 2 is observations that could only be made by non-ordinary means. Like I was telling you earlier, the young girl who described her own resuscitation during a time that her eyes were taped closed, and in fact, she was clinically dead. And then the gold standard of studies are clinical studies, which are prospective in nature. And I'll describe later exactly what I mean by that. But these are case-controlled studies in which we carefully control for the kinds of questions that people have. Are these experiences caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain? Are they caused by medications? Are they caused by the scary psychological stresses of nearly dying? And prospective studies they control for all of those. Then there's considerable anatomical evidence. We're going to learn that we actually have a God spot, and we have a spiritual area in our brain which allows us to have these experiences. And then we're going to learn that recent discoveries in cognitive neuroscience, as well as theoretical physics, they support the accounts of people who've had near-death experiences. They don't directly prove that near-death experiences are real, but we learn that what we learn from near-death experiences is consistent with what we've recently learned from theoretical physics, cognitive neuroscience, and frankly, the teachings of the ancient rabbis and Buddhists from 2,500 years ago. So we're just now science is catching up with ancient wisdom. We're going to learn about the psychoneurolinguistic analysis of final words done by Lisa Smart. And then we're going to discover that there's actual experimental evidence documenting that near-death experiences are real. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, first of all, the collection of stories. Okay, so this is how science works. The first thing that happens with science is that people make observations. And Raymond Moody, my mentor and also my brother-in-law, I've known for 30 years. He is both an MD and a philosopher, PhD, and he would give lectures, and people would come up to him after his lectures and tell him of their near-death experiences and what it was like to die. And he collected their experiences and found similarities in them. He found that, in fact, they, what I had previously referred to. The sensation of separating from the body, seeing this light, entering into the light, and mostly this perception that, like a young girl told me, I wasn't dead at all. I was still alive. Some part of me was still alive. Well, why don't we just dismiss these stories? I mean, as just crazy hallucinations. I'd like you to hear one of these stories. And this is the most moving near-death experience that I'm aware of. And I think that, well, I'll just tell you, I was recently asked, why aren't near-death experiences just some sort of chaotic visions of the dying brain? I want you to, think about that. As you hear this story, do you think that this is someone who's had an intense spiritual experience? Or do you think this is someone who's just describing some crazy fireworks of the brain?
Dr. Kennedy was returning home from giving a lecture overseas to find his friend and house sitter sitting on the stairs in a psychotic state.
I saw sitting on the stairs there my friend Abdul, who had been house setting for me, during that week I was gone. And I noticed that he was beating sweat across his brow. And I said, How are you? Well, at that moment in time, he screamed at the top of his lungs, incredibly loud. And I hadn't noticed, but he had a steel tennis racket in his right hand. And then there's a break in my memory, and I don't remember anything until, I guess a few moments later, waking up on the floor. And then I noticed that he was swinging what turned out to be a dagger. And it appeared to me that I really didn't have a chance, that he had gained the upper hand, and that I was going to die. And as I looked over his shoulder, I could see a kind of hallway. And I don't have a hallway in that part of my house. And at that moment, time stopped. Where the hallway had been, there appeared a light. And then it began to take on the characteristics of a kind of personality. And then it gave me a question. And it shot a question. I have to say it this way. It shot a question into me, like an arrow into my chest, not with words, but with just the heart of the thought itself. And the question was, will you come now or later? And I wanted to know what might be next. And on the other hand, I could see aspects of my life which were just clearly unfinished. I had a 3-year-old son at that time. I was full of his spirit. It was his presence which really made the decision. It was heck no, I'm not leaving this now. I'm not finished. And so I gave the answer back, like directly as the question was given to me. I stayed.
It was 10 years before Dr. Kennedy was able to speak about his near-death experience and to then be able to understand what he had seen and felt.
After this, it occurred to me that the love from this light was so overwhelming that this life must have something to do about learning love like that. Learning to love like that, or learning, perhaps even more to the point, learning to be loved like that, to actually experience the love that people have for us.
Ron's story has been used by counselors to give comfort to families of murder victims who feared their loved ones died alone and in pain.
If this light could appear to me in these circumstances, and I was being murdered, and yet I was not going to die alone, that was plain. And I was going to die in a sea of enormous love. And so, you know, if I had anything to say to people, I guess it would be, you know, those people you love who have died, and maybe in the most extreme circumstances. If my experience is any indication, those people did not die alone, as you would fear that they did. You know, they died with great love around them.
Wow. You know, I can't tell you, you know, I'm moved every time that I see that, and I've seen it dozens of times. Well, so now you can understand why me as a medical scientist, I take very seriously this question of, are these experiences real? Because the implications, if they are real, is that life is about learning to love like that sense of unconditional love, or even more importantly, learning to accept the love that others have for each other. So the issue of whether this is a real experience that we can trust, or whether this is some crazy hallucination of the brain, is a very important one. And let's see what science has to say about it. The next phase in which, you know, understanding these experiences, now that we're alerted that these experiences happen, that these collections of stories, let's see what we can think about these stories. Well, it's very interesting that in these stories, they often make observations that couldn't be made, you know, through ordinary means. They can only be made if, in fact, the person is out of their body and viewing the world from, you know, an expanded sense of consciousness, unlike what I originally thought was that when the brain dies, consciousness, of course, ceases. This is a young girl that we resuscitated from bacterial meningitis. You can see at the bottom of the picture, the figure at the head of the gurney is wearing a hat. That's not something you're going to see on TV. That's not something that she could invent. She, in fact, saw me wearing that hat. And the reason is because in the hubbub of resuscitation, our custom was that the team leader would wear a hat so they could be quickly identified. You can see a figure at the top of the gurney there. That's my partner, Dr. Christopher. He has his arms perfectly flexed. That could be a diagram right out of the American Heart Association's techniques for resuscitation. She certainly got that right. And then she floats out of her body. That's her figure in the middle of the screen without any feet, interestingly enough. In the top, my top left is a rainbow that she said told her who she was and where she was to go. You know, I mean, wow. And then in my top right is a figure of Jesus, who she said was sitting on a log. Odd, you know, these experiences have the feel of the authentic spiritual experience because they're odd. They're not the kind of thing somebody would make up. And she also said that for Christians who are watching this, that Jesus is very nice. There's 3 angels. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, I want everyone to see Dr. Morse. I like you very, very much. So, that to me is one of the compelling piece of evidence that they're actually having experience and that that's real, is that the observations that they make could only be made frequently from if they were truly out of their body and if their consciousness was truly independent of a functioning brain. Here's another nice example here. In my top left-hand corner, this is a young girl. She also nearly drowned. She's in a very typical heaven. You might just think, oh, this is just a child's vision of heaven. There she is. There's beautiful flowers. There's clouds, etc. except that she's looking down, and in the bottom left of the picture is her brother who had not yet been born, and he has a large heart in his chest. And she told me that she had to come back to life, that she had to leave this heavenly place because she had to help her mother to take care of her brother who would be born with a damaged heart, is what she told me. And, again, I feel so grateful, so blessed that because, I think that when you hear these stories second and third hand, they lose their the intensity. But, I personally know she drew me this picture, and then 3 months later, her brother was born and had congenital heart disease, which had not previously been diagnosed. So, I was able to witness firsthand something that I know doesn't quite have the, mean that much to hearing it second and third hand. In the right-hand corner of my screen is a young man who had a cardiac arrest. During the time of his cardiac arrest, you can see at the top of the screen, it's very interesting. You can see a little figure there. These pictures are quite old, and it's headed towards a dark diagonal. That's the tunnel that he's headed towards to go down that tunnel. But in the bottom left-hand corner, he said that his mother and his grandfather were hugging. Well, there's no way that he would have known that his grandfather was in the hospital. At the time that he was hospitalized, his grandfather was several hundred miles away. And so he was still comatose while the grandfather came to the hospital, and he was in fact correct. The mother and the grandfather were hugging at the time of his cardiac arrest. Okay. So, based on these types of stories, we then at the Seattle Children's Hospital and the University of Washington, we determined that we wanted to do a true gold standard prospective research study. Well, what does that mean? A prospective study means that we don't let people come to us with stories. Instead, we identified survivors of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital over a 15-year period of time, and then we went and interviewed them. So that makes all the difference in the world. And we carefully compared them with patients who also had lack of oxygen to the brain, treated with all types of medications, narcotics, anesthetic agents, and also were in the scary environment of an intensive care unit setting. And certainly those patients also thought that they were going to die. And we did this study. I'll have to tell you, originally I did it because we thought we would show that near-death experiences were just sort of an invention of the mind after the fact. But that's why we do research. We often have unanticipated results. And we studied 26 children who we identified as being near death, who had survival rates of less than 5%. And 24 of those children had some sort of near-death experience. And I have to tell you, one of the children who didn't have an experience, here's her story. She was with her father and a family friend fishing in Lake Washington in Seattle. And she accidentally fell overboard. She sank to the bottom of Lake Washington. Her father and family friend free dove to try to retrieve her body, and they couldn't see anything in the murky darkness. And suddenly, they say that her body was lit up by a bright light, and that allowed them to see where she was, and they were successful then at getting her back into the boat and getting her eventually to a children's hospital where we resuscitated her. But she had no memory of this experience, so we had to call her negative, that she didn't have a near-death experience. And yet her story is quite interesting, quite compelling. In fact, her father was so astonished by what happened that he he's I've got to show my assistant here something. He was so astonished by this that the next day he and his friend went out there with a scuba deer, and they actually sat at the bottom of Lake Washington to see if this was some stray, light, or some stray, thing of sunlight or something like that that might have caused this experience. And of course, they saw nothing. They didn't see anything. So she was one of the negative ones. We then studied over 100. We studied over 100 children who were not near death, but had a lack of oxygen to the brain and such as that. And in fact, those children didn't have any kind of experience. Those are the ones who fit what we understand neurology, classic neurology to be. They had no memory of the time that they were comatose. So this type of study was then later replicated by Pin van Lommel in the Netherlands, a cardiologist. They did a much more extensive study of near-death experiences in adults. They did a much more extensive study in adults, and they found out that, in fact, the same thing is true. That gold standard objective studies with proper case controls document that the near-death experience is, in fact, the dying experience. It will happen to us all when we die. And they published their study in The Lancet, arguably the world's most prestigious medical journal. We published our study in Clinical Pediatrics, devoted an entire issue to it, and in the American Medical Association's pediatric journals. So certainly clinical studies document that these experiences are real. So I love these pictures. We had children draw us pictures. In the top left, I already showed you that picture of a young girl that nearly died in the swimming pool. She said she was crawling down a tunnel that had brightly colored bricks. These details are odd. They clearly are not coming from some cultural idea of what heaven is like. I've never heard in Sunday school that we crawl to heaven down a tunnel lined with colored bricks. And she said that a woman named Elizabeth assisted her and came there to help her. In the bottom right is a young girl that nearly died of infectious mononucleosis. I had to stick a needle in her heart to resuscitate her. So that is near death. And during that time that my team was resuscitating her, she said that her grandmother was sitting there next to her. And she said, I was just so shocked to see her. I was sitting here. I was in the gurney in the bed, and there was my grandmother. She was sitting there in a chair, surrounded by a white light. And then she was back. She said, I was back. And I said to her, what do you mean that you were back? And she goes, that's what I'm trying to figure out. So again, I feel, I want to share these experiences. One of my great motivations is that to hear these experiences for the first time, to me, is one of the best proofs that they're real, because that something clearly happened to her that she could not explain. So that's not an invention of the mind after the fact. In my top right-hand corner is a boy who at 9 months of age had a cardiac arrest. We went and interviewed him when he was 3 years old. He had not told anybody of his experience or anything like that. We asked him, did he remember anything from the time that he was sick? And he said, yes, he was crawling down a tunnel. And you can see in the center, the tunnel was dark, and then it becomes progressively light until the top of the picture there were golden fields where he could run and double jump with God. That's what he told us. And again, these are patients who had not previously, by and large, discussed their story, but told us after we interviewed them for the first time. On the left of my picture here is a young man. This is his only experience. So, if every child is, I'll tell you what his experience is in a second, but if every child is saying, oh yeah, I floated out of my body and I saw Jesus, and they were telling the exact same story, well, then I would think that this was perhaps cultural contamination. But every story seems to be very different. This boy says this is his entire experience. He said that when, he died, he suddenly was in a tunnel that was lined with airplane landing lights. This is very important. Each one has a very different description of the experience. And as we'll learn later on why that is, it's because we interpret this with a spiritual language, which is a unique language that speaks to us. And he said, forget my body, forget being alive. All I wanted to do was get to that light. And that was the totality of his experience. On the right-hand side, we see a young girl who's describing what she said was Jesus, but her Jesus looks more like Santa Claus. She also has angels. And then, again, these are patients that we identified as having cardiac arrest. We went out and interviewed them. She had never told her experience to anyone before we came and interviewed her. And I asked her why. And she said, I didn't think you were supposed to be able to talk to God. So, so she, this is an important issue that as a society, we feel that people who have these experiences are crazy. And even at age 8, she was aware of that. She kept quiet about her experience. I know that we have many, I've had people have said to me, I don't like you using the word God. I believe in a higher power. And, people often associate the word God with, the bearded dude in the sky that, from the Old Testament that, has, a lot of emotional, negative emotional beliefs to people, etc. But I have to tell you that children just say that this light is God. And this is a young girl on the left-hand side here. This is right after the tube had been taken out of her that was helping her to breathe. And she couldn't speak yet, but she asked for one of those etch-a-sketches because she had something very important to tell us. And this is the very first word she had on her resuscitation is, God saved me. And later she said that that's because she heard us talking about how we had saved her. So she wanted to make sure that we knew it was God. In the right-hand picture there, again, this is a young girl. Most of the children that I interviewed just say it's a light. They saw, I saw a light. It had a lot of good things in it. One boy told me, he said, I saw a light, and then it was weird. You guys sucked me back into my body. But you can tell that this light, is, it's a rainbow with a whole bunch of hearts on it. So this is not just some sort of spasming of the optic nerve, which is one of the theories of what these experiences are. This isn't some sort of tunnel vision because there's double innervation of the retina, and this is what happens to the brain when it dies. Absolutely not. This is a light that is filled with love. And contains wisdom and knowledge. Well, so I've made the point again and again that these experiences are not part of a dysfunctional dying brain. So what are they? Well, it turns out that's been known for well over 100 years, that we as human beings have an area in our brain which actually allows us to see something that most people call God. And this has been known about for a considerable period of time, but just nobody ever linked that type of information, that research, with the research on near-death experiences. It was just thought that people were having religious hallucinations, so to speak. This is from the work of Wilder Penfield. He's considered to be the father of modern neuroscience. And what he did was he took electrical needles and he stimulated areas of the brain while he was doing operations on them so that he could learn what different areas of the brain did. He stimulated the motor cortex, and people would move their arm, or they'd move their leg. He stimulated the language areas of the brain, and people would talk. He stimulated the smell area of the brain, and people had unusual odors or smells. And then right here, in the right temporal lobe and the hippocampus, deep within the right side of the brain, he stimulated, I've shown the 3 areas that he stimulated, and patients said things like, "Oh God, I'm leaving my body." Or more intriguing, consistent with the girl that showed sort of being half out of the tunnel, patients would say, "I'm half in and I'm half out." And a gentleman named Michael Persinger in Canada has stimulated this area of the brain with a magnetic helmet, which sends stimulations to this area of the brain. And in fact, people have near-death experiences, the whole thing. But it's very interesting. When they describe their experience, when these are stimulated in the laboratory, then they'll say there's a light, but they don't have that same, "Oh gosh, it was a light," a light that had a lot of good things in it, etc. These studies where this anatomical area of the brain is stimulated is some sort of dry run of the real experience. And so it's just sort of perceived in a very, almost a mechanistic way. And that led those researchers to conclude that these experiences are just in the brain. They're not just in the brain. Consciousness uses that area of the brain to create the experience. Everything is just in our brain. I mean, when I move my arm, that's because my motor cortex is firing. You're hearing my words right now is just in your brain. The auditory areas of your brain are in fact creating this experience. So we learn from these types of studies that in fact we have a spiritual area in our brain, something I call the God spot. And so this is the way I like to look at it. We're linked to the divine. Each one of us is hardwired for spiritual transformation. So the near-death experience, far from being some sort of crazy hallucination at the point of death, when we learn about the neuroanatomy of the experience, we learn that it's an area of the brain that for most of us works properly, perhaps for the first time in our life during the process of dying. And so here is God, and then his finger is through the brain and then to people. Or here in the right hand, you can see the brain is filled with light from the right temporal lobe, and then that's a direct connection to this universal consciousness. And it's very exciting. We now know how to access this ultimate reality, this God spot, through meditation. And so modern fMRI studies, which are functional studies of the brain, have clearly shown that we have an area in our brain at the back of the brain called Brodmann's area. During profound meditation, this area of the brain turns off. And it's the area of the brain that organizes the 5 senses that we have into coherent, auditory pictures auditory sounds and pictures, etc. This area of the brain actually turns off, similar, of course, to the process of dying. The five senses actually stop, of course, because our brain has nearly died at that point. During meditation, this area turns off. That then leads, you can see in the right-hand side, to increased activity in our frontal lobe, which then in turn causes right temporal lobe activity. And meditators have experiences which are profoundly like near-death experiences. And a couple of nice studies have been done in the last couple of years comparing the experiences of Buddhist meditators and compared them to people who describe near-death experiences, and they're exactly the same. So the next piece of evidence that these experiences are real comes to us, interestingly enough, from cognitive neuroscience and theoretical physics. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we learn about the near-death experience, we learn that when this reality dies, the input from our five senses disappears. Our ego is extinguished. Far from that being the end of life, consciousness persists, and it's an expanded sense of awareness and consciousness. It's in fact a merging with a ultimate reality, our universal consciousness. And this reality is perceived as being light, a light that is all-knowing, has a lot of knowledge in it. I've had an adult once told me that when she was in this light, she felt she knew everything. And then as she returned to her body, she said it was horrible because all the wisdom that she had learned just, left her body. Left her mind. Well, the body and mind are one. That's clear. And so is that credible? Well, cognitive neuroscience tells us that, in fact, this reality that we think of as real is, in fact, created by our mind. What happens is reality, theoretical physics tells us, is an electromagnetic pattern of energy. And time and space do not exist in this electromagnetic pattern of energy. We then have bodily sensors which sample the information from this electromagnetic reality, translate that into biochemical molecules, etc. And then those are transmitted to our brain, and then our brain creates this reality that we think is so real. And so that's what dies when we die. And we apparently return again to this ultimate reality. And this is completely consistent with what we've learned from theoretical physics and cognitive neuroscience. Far from this idea that we have that science is against spirituality. Well, that's probably true. The science of the 17th century was against the spirituality of the 16th century. But we have now learned that, in fact, the science of the 21st century is very consistent with what we learned from near-death experiences. So real, we have to, when we're going to ask our near-death experiences are real, we have to say, what is real? And real clearly is a timeless, spaceless pattern of energy that's imbued with unconditional love. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of Albert Einstein, who said that matter is energy, energy is light, and we are all light beings. So that's the word from theoretical physics. And I just think this is fascinating. At the bottom right of my screen, the left-hand picture is a brain cell. The right-hand picture is what a galaxy looks like. And look how absolutely identical they are. So the patterns that exist within our brain, the physicists tell us, resonate with the patterns of the universe, and they seem to be very similar. Well, I like to just show these little, how do we know? How does neuroscience know that our eyes, for example, are not video cameras? They're not. We are not actually seeing anything. We are creating a reality from the electromagnetic patterns that surround us. So we don't see anything. Our eyes are not video cameras. And the cognitive neuroscientists like to show this. In the left-hand picture there, as you stare at it, you'll see, or most people see, movement. Well, it's actually not moving. It's actually a static picture. But the person who creates this optical illusion is tricking our brain into real, thinking that it's moving. Just a nice example. Here's a nice example here on the right-hand side. Some people see this as a young woman. Some people see it as an old lady. And yet it's the same information. It's just how your brain perceives it. And I'll let you, you come back to it. I'll just tell you that right there, where there's the young lady's chin, could be an old lady's nose. And so, it's just our perception. I mean, what we think then changes our perception. And we think it's the other way around. We think that our perception creates images in our brain, but in fact, it's a two-way street. This is one of my favorite ones here. On the left-hand side, you'll see there's a checkerboard square that's an A and a checkerboard square that's a B. And on the left-hand side, they look like they're different. The A looks very dark and the B looks very white. But that's actually the brain has been fooled because of the shadow that's shown by that column. In fact, in the right-hand side of your picture, when lines are placed over A and B that distract you then from the optical illusion of the shadow and the column, you can see that the A and B are, in fact, exactly the same color. So this idea that our eyes are video cameras clearly is not so. We create this reality, and cognitive neuroscientists love to do this kind of experiment because it can show them that sometimes we create the wrong reality, and that can be then extended to perceptions of angels, perceptions of spiritual things, etc. We can clearly, understand realities which we can't see with our eyes. Well, so how would you know? How would you know if an angel was in the room with you? Certainly when someone tells us that there's an angel, that we have to trust that it's very possible that they are seeing something that we didn't see because our brain did not expect to see it. Okay, so we learned from this that cognitive neuroscience it also reinforces the lessons of the near-death experience. Well, there's some very interesting research that comes from Lisa Smart in her Final Words project. And what she documented is that there's a unique linguistic quality to one's final words. So when people are dying and they say things like, oh, I see a light, or wow, or various types of things that seem crazy to us, that they're in fact using a metaphorical type of spiritual speech. And Lisa Smart describes it as a personal language of a spiritual nature. So it really only has meaning between that person and the universe at large, as opposed to the social language that we all share. We have to, of course, all agree that red means red, that, that a chair is a chair. And yet, as I studied near-death experiences, and other researchers have struggled to understand, why does one person describe heaven one way and another person has completely different words to create the same experience? And we learn the answer to that when we study Lisa Smart's work. Her research explains the wide variations in descriptions of near-death experiences, heaven, and God. Neuroscience perhaps can document that this spiritual language comes from a different part of the brain. Just as Julio Perez, a neuroscientist in Brazil, documented that automatic writing, which is inspired by mediumship and is of a spiritual nature, is actually generated in a different area of the brain than ordinary writing. And let me just go back here for a second, etc. Do you remember Dr. Kennedy's near-death experience? He used the type of speech that Lisa Smart documented occurs to the dying when he described his near-death experience. This very articulate physician suddenly says he was asked a question that wasn't with words, but it shot like an arrow into his heart. Will you stay? And, so that's the type of metaphoric speaking that we see in dying patients. And then his response was, no, he didn't want to stay because he felt that there was too much left in his life. That's one, piece of evidence. Further research needs to be done to show that the language of the near-death experience is similar to the dying experience. And I think that this will become a marker for all of spiritual experience, that we'll learn that by analyzing the linguistics of spiritual experiences in general, we'll be able to tell whether they came from the right brain, and so therefore our true interactions with this ultimate consciousness, or whether they're inventions of the mind invented by the left brain. And just by linguistic analysis, we may be able to make that important distinction, because that's, from a common sense point of view, that's what we're all asking. Did he just make it up? Is it just an invention of the mind, which of course would be left brain and then would use left brain linguistics, or is it a true spiritual experience, which of course would then be right brain? Well, okay, I've given you a lot of sort of, the prospective studies of near-death experiences I think are very solid, but the rest of this I think is all very circumstantial evidence, and people are not aware that there's actually experimental proof that near-death experiences are real. And one of my contributions to this field is that I've been able to look in many different sources. The information comes from, medical manuscripts written in the 1940s and 1950s of Wilder Penfield. And this information comes from space and aeronautics journals, which, let's face it, most people don't routinely read. And yet Dr. Winery is an old friend of mine. He did research which clearly documents that near-death experiences are real. And I'll show you that.
F-14s of the United States Navy, among the most costly weapon systems in the world and capable of over twice the speed of sound. Tight turns and rapid acceleration subject the pilots to massive gravitational forces that drive the blood from the brain, starving it of oxygen. To protect their investment, the Navy has had to devise ways of testing the tolerance of pilots to forces up to 9 times greater than gravity. the aspiring Top Gun enters this capsule, his future is on the line. Loss of consciousness could disqualify him from one of the most glamorous jobs in the service.
Flight deck is manned and ready. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, mark.
By using this giant centrifuge to drive the blood from the pilot's head, the naval scientists are in fact replicating the first stages of brain death under perfect laboratory conditions.
We probably are unique in having the ability of taking individuals completely healthy to the point of unconsciousness.
Dr. James Winnery, Chief Aeromedical Scientist. During a 12-year period, Dr. Winnery has studied over 500 cases of unconsciousness induced by the centrifuge, and his findings strongly support the idea of a physical basis for the visions induced in the dying brain.
The symptoms that these individuals were experiencing turned out to be very similar to the reported experiences that individuals suffering near death had. Bright lights, tunnel vision, it being a very euphoric experience, not wanting to be disturbed from the unconsciousness. We occasionally will get an out-of-body experience during the time that they're exposed to high head-to-foot GZ forces.
Tunnels, bright lights, euphoria, even a sense of being out of the body.
Bumper cars. Bumper cars. Oh no. Now I know why you want to go back through this, might hurt, Dr. Winnery.
Okay, so this is a nice example of how an experimental study precisely dovetails with the clinical research that we did. What Dr. Winnery's research showed is that when he took pilots and put them in this centrifuge and he whirls them to the point of death, where theoretically the blood has stopped flowing in their brain, first they're unconscious, then they become comatose. Only then, after they're comatose, when they come to the brink of death, does consciousness return. And this consciousness that returns is the perception of bright lights, which, Dr. Winnery, being from, the military, et cetera, doesn't talk about that they're filled with unconditional love, et cetera, but that's what civilian people will describe. I've interviewed some of these pilots, and to hear their experiences in sort of the clipped monotone, I was out of my body, then I saw a bright light, sir, it's interesting. And then you can see the gentleman at the end, he says, bumper cars. Well, the narrator of this video seems to be saying, oh, because he saw bumper cars, he couldn't have been having a real experience. And so that's why I've spent this time trying to discuss that this experience at the point of death has its own personal language. And so bumper cars meant something to this gentleman that, whether, we don't know what it is, but it's clearly associated with joy and this sense of unconditional love. So rather than, the dismissing the experience, oh, he saw bumper cars, so he couldn't have had a real experience, we understand that this experience that he had after he was on the point of clinical death really represented this expanded consciousness and this perception of this ultimate reality. So with all of this evidence, why is science still having a problem with it? Why don't scientists well, one of the reasons I've already alluded to is that the pieces of this information exist in diverse different fields, You have to know everything from anthropology to psychology to space and aeronautics journals, etc. So that's one reason. But I think that there is another reason. And it is as follows.
What do you say to people who say, this is hogwash? This is not science.
They've never read the literature, and they never have any explanation other than, it can't be that.
And there you go. I think that really this information is emotionally challenging, particularly if you're in the old paradigm of thinking that the brain creates consciousness. I think with all this information published in prestigious medical journals, everybody pretty much agrees that, any scientist that's looked at this information knows that these experiences are real. And yet I think that our initial reflex, I understand that trained at Johns Hopkins, is to just go, it can't be that. It can't be that. It can't be the obvious. People say that when they die, they see a loving God who helps them to understand their lessons of love. That would seem like such an obvious thing to just say, sure, that's what happens. But it's emotionally challenging. And I think at the end of the day, I don't think that, I think that ultimately spiritual issues are a matter of faith. And I'm not sure that we can, we can have all the science that we want. And yet I'm not sure that is going to convince everybody. I think that science, it's not enough to understand the near-death experience. That these are spiritual experiences that require faith, that require a personal sense of communication with this loving light. Christians call it Jesus, Buddhists call it Buddha. When we studied these experiences in Japan, they had Japanese religious figures that they said was part of the experience. But we know from the underpinnings of the great religions is mysticism. And mystics of all religions agree that there's some sort of loving light that awaits us when we die. And I just think that, I've talked to people who've had profound spiritual experiences that you could start a religion from, and yet they dismiss it. They just think, oh, it's just some crazy dream. Well, why am I so passionate about this? First, let me just review this information here. We are doing ongoing research. Please contact me at just my name, Melvin Morse at hotmail.com. I've got a website, melvinmorsemd.com. Another website, melvinmorse.net. I'm grateful to share this experience with you. That's for sure. But I think ultimately we each have to make our own decision as to what the meaning of these experiences are. I can share with you today that science certainly validates the experience. I can tell you that we're a society in which we dismiss these types of experiences at a time when we need these experiences more than ever. We need to have this message that we're all interconnected, that we're all one, that there's a universal consciousness that is in each one of us. And yet we can access this consciousness by using the God spot in our brain. But at the end of the day, each one of us has to make this decision as to whether this loving light is real. My next webinar, I'm going to discuss how we can understand the neuroscience of spirituality to have these types of understandings and experiences while we're still alive, so that we can learn our lessons of love and understand that that's why we're here, is to learn lessons of love. And we can do that while we're still alive through a variety of mental techniques. I'll be discussing protocol that comes, interestingly enough, from the military, controlled remote viewing or profound meditation can help us to unlock this spiritual awareness that we all have the ability to contact. Thank you very much. And now, this is challenging material, and I threw a lot at you in a very short period of time. So what questions do you have?
There are two we have. They're both from Brenton. The first is, do people with temporal stimulation have out-of-body experiences that can be verified, as the ones you mentioned earlier?
Okay, so that's a great question. And the answer to that question shows the problem with this field. Is that researchers, unfortunately, have a very narrow interests. And they're frequently not familiar with the rest of the literature or even these sort of greater questions. Because the question there is, can people have out-of-body experiences stimulated by, for example, Michael Persinger's God helmet, he calls it. And could they have verifiable experiences, be asked to go out of their body and see something in another room or something like that? And the short answer is those questions, unfortunately, have not been answered. That type of research just hasn't been done. The people that do that kind of research frequently think that these experiences are simply hallucinations of the brain. We've known about the God spot for well over 100 years, and they've always been described as the area of the brain which causes hallucinations of seeing God. So obviously, if you're thinking to yourself, isn't it interesting that there's an area of the brain which causes hallucinations, you're unlikely to then take it to the next step and see whether verifiable experiences can occur. However, I love your question because it turns out that there's other evidence that human beings can get information about this reality through non-ordinary means, independent of our five senses. And that comes again from the US military, who did the experimental studies showing that near-death experiences are real. They developed a protocol for something called controlled remote viewing. And controlled remote viewing papers have been published in Nature, again, one of the world's most prestigious medical and scientific journals. Controlled remote viewers have won virtually every award that civilians can get from commendations. Two presidents commended them for the information that they've achieved. And anyone can learn to do controlled remote viewing. And that's a very dramatic way of showing that we can, in fact, get information independent of our ordinary senses while we're still conscious and alive. For example, the most dramatic example of this is Ingo Swann. They developed controlled remote viewing at the Stanford Research Institute. He did a reading of the planet Jupiter. And this was before Voyager had actually gone to Jupiter. And Ingo Swann said from his remote viewings of Jupiter, he said that Jupiter had rings, and he described other things about Jupiter. And so, wait a minute, Jupiter doesn't have rings. And in fact, when the Voyager went past Jupiter, it was documented that Jupiter had rings. And, so this isn't like psychics that, they said, oh yeah, 10 years ago, I predicted something that happened today. This is a case where he made the prediction and then subsequent research documented that his experience was real.
We have 3 more questions. Maybe you could say them out loud to make sure people can hear them. Brenton, and one more. what do you think of providing hospital staff with caps with random patterns on them to help verify the out-of-body experiences?
So that's a great question. The question is, what about having like nurses or doctors having caps, and then like putting maybe a symbol or a letter on top of the cap that could only be seen if they're truly out of their body and truly seeing seeing the world from a different perspective. Well, actually, that study has been done. It's a multi-institutional study done by hospitals, and what they did was they had reader boards, and they put reader boards in operating rooms and emergency rooms in places which you couldn't see from the patient's perspective. So you could only see that if you're truly out of your body. And that study, completely negative, did not, in fact, have any examples of people having cardiac arrest who could then report which was on a reader board. This doesn't surprise me, and in fact, I really didn't think of it as when this study was first proposed. A number of researchers predicted that it would be negative because it's assuming that when you die, you're going to be interested in what's on a reader board somewhere in the operating room. Simply not the case. People, when they die, they're preoccupied. They see their own body. They describe what's going on around the body. And then they're attracted and interested in this light that has unconditional love, this alternative reality. And so it doesn't surprise me that they're not making the types of observations that we wish they would make. And nevertheless, in cases of patients that I've resuscitated, so I know they were clinically dead, I can think of a dozen or more cases in which they describe just incidental things. I had a patient once who we were wondering what was wrong with the cardioversion machine. The paddles just didn't seem to be working, and so we were upset about it, etc. And then he revived, and it wasn't necessary to cardiovert him. And he told us, he said, your machine was unplugged. And sure enough, he was right. In the hubbub of resuscitation, somebody had, kicked the plug or kicked the cord, and it was unplugged. So enough of these types of observations already exist, and they're well documented in the literature. And it doesn't surprise me that they're not seeing what we want them to see in a very sort of artificially designed experiment.
All right, we have about a half hour left and 7 questions. So,
all right.
Gina asks, is the pineal gland the God spot?
Okay, the pineal gland is not the God spot. And I know that back in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, it was thought of as being sort of the master control gland. And there have been some very interesting studies done out of Brazil in which they show that there's unusual calcifications in the pineal gland, and that you have to go to a country like Brazil where many physicians are what they call spiritists. And so spiritists, believe that consciousness comes first, and then consciousness works through the brain to create this environment. So, we call that top-down consciousness. So in other words, consciousness is first, then information theory comes next, and then the laws of physics are based on information theory, and then the laws of physics then dictate the specifics of the material world. This worldview, by the way, doesn't contradict anything with a materialistic worldview. It just says that consciousness came first. So when you have physicians and scientists who have that point of view, then when they see something like calcifications in the pineal gland, which are recognized in this country, we see them as artifacts, and yet there is ongoing research to try to understand if these various calcifications and mineral deposits in the pineal gland might somehow resonate with this universal consciousness. However, to directly answer your question, the God spot is clearly our deep right temporal lobe, so it's right here, and the hippocampus, which is our master control area and responsible for our long-term memories, which makes sense because when you think about it, when someone's brain stops working, you might wonder, well, how do they retrieve their memories after they come back to life again? And the answer to that may well be that memories are stored outside of the brain. Now, if anybody thinks that that's some sort of scientific or medical heresy, that is simply not the case. In fact, the father of modern memory research made that very comment himself. Again, not familiar with near-death studies, but he said in his study of memory, this is Fred Lashley, he said, if I didn't know better, I would think that memories were stored outside of the brain. So that's not an unusual thought at all. But and we published about the God spot in 2005. Other neuroscientists also wrote papers at the time commenting on the God spot. There has not been any research since then that disputes that we have a God spot. In fact, the only research that's been done is the research of Mario Beauregard at the University of Toronto. And he said, no, there's no God spot. So I'm like, what? He said, yeah, it's a God brain. And his research shows that perhaps 30% of the human brain is dedicated to allowing us to have this communication with God. I'll just use the word that kids use.
All right. This is from Jerry. I suggest you can also access the God spot through hypnosis. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Can you access the God spot through hypnosis? Okay. The short answer is there is not enough time or research to answer that question adequately. However, this is basically my thoughts on it. Hypnosis is a concentrated form of thought, of consciousness, in which through the hypnotic induction techniques, the person is able to focus their concentration in a very specific way. So, for example, under hypnosis, people often are allergic to things that they're not allergic to when they're out of the hypnotic state. There's accelerated wound healing. There's all sorts of very fascinating mind-body situations through hypnosis. But I'm not going to dispute any of that. I'm going to intrigue you by pointing out that numerous researchers have shown that any of the well-documented and verifiable effects of hypnosis can be done without hypnosis. That it simply isn't necessary to go into a hypnotic state to, for example, accelerate wound healing, stop smoking, or any of the documented benefits of hypnosis. Well, why is that important to your question? Because it really shows us that hypnosis is simply a way of understanding that we have more abilities of our brain, the mind brain, as neuroscientists now call it. Nobody calls it the mind or the brain anymore, but the mind brain is completely untapped. We're probably using, 3, 5, 10% of what we're actually capable of. And hypnosis, we don't need that formal hypnotic induction technique, except we do need it. We do need it for the simple reason, it's like Dumbo. Dumbo had to think that he had to hold a feather in order to fly, and so that was sort of his mental crutch. And it took him a long time to realize that he could fly without the feather. Well, so that's in understanding the human mind brain. Hypnosis is our feather, and yet we're capable of these things without hypnosis. Specifically then through meditation or protocols such as controlled remote viewing, etc. Controlled remote viewing, by the way, does not involve an altered state of consciousness at all. Controlled remote viewing is a protocol which works, which allows us to access information from beyond our ordinary five senses. You can see things across the country. You can contact people who have died, get information from them, or like Ingo Swann, you can get information from the universe. And it is not necessary to have an altered state of consciousness at all. Just like, so with hypnosis, I think that people are able to access the God spot through hypnosis, but that shouldn't distract us from realizing that we can access that without hypnosis. In fact, people are doing so all the time. It's called intuition, and that to me is the challenge. That's why understanding neuroscience can help us to understand the manual of our brain, because we all want to use our intuition. All of us want to make judgments and good decisions based on intuition, but we don't want to be ruled by our fears and fantasies. And so how do you differentiate between the two? And so clearly fears and fantasies are left brain, intuition is right brained, and that's the challenge, is to learn how to differentiate between the two. And neuroscience can help us to do that. And I'll be giving a webinar on that coming up.
Norman asks, are any NDEs, do we ever hear negative results from NDEs? I'm not too sure what he means by results.
Can the question is do people have negative NDEs?
And negative results.
Or negative results? Can the person clarify for us what they consider to be a negative result? But I will simply answer that the best I can. First of all, many NDEs are terrifying. Children frequently describe the experience as weird. The sensation of being out of your physical body is quite scary. I've had patients, children, have told me that they didn't know how they were going to get back in, and that was terrifying to them. So the experience is disorienting. As you saw from Dr. Kennedy, it took him 10 years before he was able to even talk about his experience. Do people see hell? Do people have visions of hell during their near-death experience? The Tennessee cardiologist Maurice Rawlings from the Bible Belt described numerous patients who had hellish visions during their near-death experience. And we learn from that we die the life we live. Absolutely. And so if you have, people who have a literal belief in a hell, frequently will have that as part of their dying experience. People who have very challenging lessons of love, serial killers, anyone is capable of doing things that they're horribly ashamed of and are very challenging. And yet when that is reviewed in the life review, not a pleasant experience. That it can be unpleasant, frightening, crushing to the ego, etc. And then the near-death experience, we did a study showing that the long-term transformation is primarily positive, but the short-term result of suddenly seeing life in a very different light frequently causes divorce, can be a very difficult transition, but long-term consequences are very positive.
This is from Daniela. How, in your opinion, would be best to integrate this kind of information and research into grief work? I am part of the International Grief Council, and we help people all the time deal with grief and looking at the bigger picture of life.
I love this question. This is my passion, and I also know Raymond Moody is his passion as well. The question is how can we integrate this with grief work? Some of that I talked about at the beginning, in which I pointed out that if we consider near-death experiences to be real, then premonitions of death, shared dying experience, after-death communications are also real. And again, the problem is a lot of times is attitude. People who often work in hospice or work in the grief-related counseling professions are trained to not explore the spirituality of the dying process. And I'll give you an example of this. In the medical and scientific literature, it's well documented that 1/2 of widows and widowers have dramatic and meaningful after-death communications with their spouse who's departed. In the pediatric world, that's as high as 75%. Furthermore, I did a study with the Southwest Sudden Infant Death Institute in which we showed that premonitions of death are very common prior to the tragedy of SIDS, and we use proper case controls, etc. Well, with all of that information, then why isn't spirituality integrated with the grieving, understanding the grieving process? It's because all of that literature dismisses these experiences as, the patient that I talked about in the beginning, crazy widow fantasies, hallucinations, after-death communications are often thought to be just some sort of persistence of the memory of the dying person. For example, one common after-death communication is a hand on the shoulder and the words whispered, "I love you, I'm okay." Well, so people will dismiss that, saying, well, that's something that happened to the grieving spouse, commonly during their life, and so they're just some sort of hallucination. There's no reason to believe that. Near-death experience, the research on near-death experience would validate that that type of hallucination is in fact real. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done on integrating our knowledge that dying is incredibly spiritually rich. It may be one of the most powerful spiritual experiences of our life. And yet, I know far more stories of people who have wonderful, people who've had shared dying experiences with their child who's died. I know after-death communications, and very tragically, they're dismissed, that they're not used as seeds to heal the grieving process. I'll give you a nice example of this. After I did my near-death research at Seattle Children's Hospital, I was called up by one of my friends who was an allergist there. And he thanked me for my research, and I'll tell you why. He had a very tragic thing happen to him. He was fishing at Lake Washington, and inexplicably, his son jumped in the car, locked the doors to the car, and took off the emergency brake. Actually, my own son had once done something similar. So, it's just a kind of crazy thing that a child would do. And that car then drifted down into the lake. The physician involved actually went into the lake and tried to push that car back onto the shore and was caught up with it. And then he had the perception that he was also leaving his physical body. And he said the perception was so vivid that he could actually see the bald patch on his head. And then he was taken up with his son to this place that, this brightly lit place that he thought was heaven. And he said it was one of the most painful experiences of his life to return to his body because he wanted to stay there with his son. But he realized, that he had other responsibilities, and he couldn't. And so he returned to his body. And then, unfortunately, his son went on to drown, and he went to the shore. And he had always just dismissed this as some sort of, crazy dream, or, some sort of fantasy, trying to make it better that his son had died and that he wasn't successful at pushing, a 3,000-pound car out of the lake. And after he heard my research, he said, now I know that what happened to me was real. That, in fact, I did go with my son to that place. And now I feel okay about my decision.
Jenny, this is from Jenny. What about the PAIR, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Program? They accumulated over 25 years of data, which suggests that conscious volition can act in remote objects.
Oh, gosh, I love this question. So this question is about the Princeton Engineering Anomalous Research Lab. And this is from the Department of Engineering at Princeton University. And the lead researcher is Bob Jaffe, who is a professor emeritus of engineering. So, I just love this research because it comes to us from the most unlikely sources. The United States military, the highly disciplined fighter pilots who are whirled in the centrifuge. And now from Princeton University. They contributed in two very important ways. First, they documented that remote viewing is real. They did extremely rigorous research on the phenomenon of remote viewing. So why is remote viewing important? Well, I learned to remote view after my near-death research because I wanted to see if it was real. And remote viewing is the sense that you are leaving your physical body and seeing things at a distance, which then can be validated through the research protocols. Because the research protocol doesn't tell you, it doesn't say, could you go over there and look at that building over there? Instead, they give you a number. They just say, could you contact this number? And it's a number that they have associated, perhaps, let's say, with a building or, the Eiffel Tower, let's say, in France. And then you come back with a detailed description of it. And only then do they reveal what the target is. And it's a very powerful experience. And it was the engineers at Princeton University that documented that remote viewing is very real. So that, to me, the reason that I learned to remote view is because that validates an important part of the near-death experience. Because children who have near-death experiences say they enter into another reality which is filled with all knowledge and that they're able to perceive the world from a sense of expanded consciousness outside of their body. Well, that's what's going on with remote viewing. Let's take the example of the Eiffel Tower. If I assign it a number as its address, so to speak, just like we have a street address, well, that's information. And so if we're able to contact a world of that's filled with universal information, well, that's a part of that world, and it's something that can be verified. And this is important. The guy named Sam Harris is a neuroscientist, and he wrote a wonderful book about faith, and which he felt that faith is something that we evolved, that is a spiritual need But he says in his book, he said, if you could actually visualize, let's say, something in the Vatican, in the Vatican library, and bring back that information to me as part of your spiritual experience, well, then I might believe that faith is real. Well, I got news for you, Dr. Harris. Remote viewers can do that. They can, in fact, go into the Vatican and bring us back information. And as he points out, he is a skeptic, but the sort of thought experiment that he posits is, in fact, validated by the actual research of remote viewing. So the importance of remote viewing is not that we can see I'm here in America and I can see the Eiffel Tower in France. Absolutely not. We've got Google Maps. We've got GPS devices for that. Of course, the military did use it for information gathering very successfully, to find things, drug tunnels, for example, in the Mexican-American border. But the real value of remote viewing is that we learn that it is possible to, as human beings, intersect with this world that those who nearly died described to us, this world, this ultimate reality. And then, like the Buddha described a lot of faith measures, he said a lot of times it's like you're taking a boat across a river. Well, of course, you're going to leave it behind after you're on the other side. And that's what remote viewing does, is it provides you with an understanding of the nature of reality. But then, you're not going to remote view to see the Eiffel Tower all the time.
Brad wants to know, in the case of after-death appearances from a loved one to the surviving, do you think these experiences are accessed through the region of the brain that you described in the anatomy discussion?
Yay! I wish I could hug you. I feel like, this is a lot of information. And yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. We have a spiritual God spot, or as Dr. Beauregard says, a spiritual area of our brain. And this area of the brain can be activated in a variety of different situations when we need it, when we need spiritual understanding, when we need to access this world of unconditional love. So when we die, when the ego dies and our five senses dies, well, then, of course, all that's left is our connection with the universal consciousness. But this can be activated during meditation. I've seen profound transformations, hardened criminals, people who you think are sociopaths, dramatically transformed. And I think in the grieving process, that these are not hallucinations, of the dying, but in fact, they are the proper functioning of our right temporal lobe and hippocampus when we're confronted with the psychological and psychic stresses of the death of a loved one. And the reason that's important is invariably these are words of comfort. And usually the most common thing that I hear is, my child stood at the foot of the bed and said, "I'm okay, Mommy." And I'll really briefly, I got to tell you this story though. I was a pediatrician, and I was working in my office in Renton, Washington, and see like 50 patients a day with ear infections. And these couple came in, and I was asked. They said to me, I asked them why you were here today, because they were adults, and they said, "Well, our son died, and we have read your research, and we wanted to know if there's any way that we can communicate with him." They said that he died, 2,363 days ago. So, they were in a lot of pain. And they pressed his picture into my hand. Well, just then I got called to the hospital to resuscitate a newborn. And I ran over and I resuscitated the newborn. And I still had this picture. I just stuffed it in my pocket. And as I was writing my note, one of the nurses just sort of looked at it. And she says to me, "So who was the medical student that was with you today?" I teach medical students, or, at the time, I was like, no medical student was, I ran over from my office, there was no medical student with me today. And she said, oh, yes, there was a medical student that was with you the entire time. And she looked at the picture and she said, look, that's him. That's the young man that I saw. And so I realized that this was a situation where these parents, their grief had actually shielded them and caused them to not be able to use this area of their brain because of their intense grief. And I went back to my office and I said to them, your son was with me when I was over resuscitating, and he wants to communicate with you. I want you to go back home and start to journal and think a thought before you go to bed at night, a sincere question from your heart, and then start to journal your first thoughts in the morning. And sure enough, they called me within a few weeks and they said, this is the first time that we've slept in the 2,000 plus days, because it didn't take very long before suddenly my son was at the foot of the bed saying, Mommy, I love you. I'm okay, Mommy. Please stop crying.
Yeah.
And they could believe that experience. They knew that experience was real.
We have one more question. I think time just enough for that. Will you please comment on the writings and the experience of Dr. Eben Alexander, whose knowledge and experience give great credibility and wide exposure to the NDE, and the important message for our times of love and oneness? And then I'll need 1 minute to make an announcement to everyone after that.
Okay, for those who are unfamiliar, Dr. Alexander is a Harvard neurosurgeon who then had a brain infection and had his own near-death experience. And he's written eloquently on the experience. And the deeper part of that question is the message of the near-death experience, whether it's from a child, or whether it's from, anyone, but particularly when it's someone like Dr. Alexander, who comes to it with, the typical skeptical view that's transformed by his own experience, so we can truly believe in what he has to say. And that message is, we are all interconnected. We are all one. That the purpose of this life is to live lessons, is to learn lessons of love, to learn to love unconditionally, to learn to accept the love that others have for us. And we need to start really paying attention to this message instead of dismissing these experiences as crazy dreams of the dying.
Thank you so much, Melvin. And I wanted to let folks know that on February 5th, we'll be speaking about DMT with Dr. Rachel Harris, who's done extensive research on the ayahuasca. So thanks for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Morris. It's been great.
Thank you all very much.
Goodbye, everyone.